Good afternoon, everyone. I am so excited as we go forward with this next episode. We have a very special guest here today, and that is my lovely wife, Dawn. And Dawn Ellicott Clinkscale is a licensed marriage and family therapist and Florida board approved supervisor which specialize in training and trauma resolution. She has also authored 5 therapeutic children's books, which is outstanding, and she has her private practice. Dawn also graduated from The Ohio State University.
True.
And then also she graduated with her master's degree in from Louisville Presbyterian Seminary. So we're very honored to have you here, my love. On last time we talked about trauma, and I kind of shared with our audience some of the trauma that I have been through as a child. So we thought it would be appropriate to have such a special person as yourself to give us some insights on that. And we have a couple questions that I would like to ask you. And the first is, how did you get interested in becoming a marriage and family therapist?
Well, I was interested in counseling when I first went to college in my 20s, but when I found out that a lot of counseling programs, all the counseling programs had internships that were required, at the time I was a single mom, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to get away from my kids at night to go do the internship, so I shifted focus until later on after we got married when I went back to school and was able to pursue that dream.
Excellent, excellent. Why did you decide to specialize in trauma-focused therapy?
Well, when I went back to school in 2009, people became much more interested in the role of trauma in creating some of the things that we were seeing in clients and patients, both in children and adults. So we noticed that people were experiencing things like ADHD, depression, anxiety, but these were really falling under the umbrella of trauma. So the concept of doing trauma-focused therapy became much more talked about, much more widely, and I decided to focus on that because I myself have been exposed to a lot of family trauma through friends at church and people at school, and thought it would be, wise just to have a lot of, additional training in that area.
Excellent, excellent. I recall even as a child, I remember in elementary school, and we had shared this story about the Scrooge, being in the Scrooge play and coming from a dysfunctional home. I can recall my teacher telling everybody from the principal that you will have a special part in the play, me as a student, and knowing that I had learning disabilities and faced with the trauma of not being the best student and recalling not getting the best grades and coming home with a F minus on my report card, and my dad would take me and put me and my sisters in a high chair. And he kind of made what he called like a dummy hat for me. And I really, that was traumatizing for me as a child. And furthermore, I recall when I went to school, the principal had told the class and our teacher, your class has been selected to perform a play called Scrooge. And I can remember my teacher saying, well, Lonnie, the only responsibility that you will have, and that would be just to roll Scrooge's coffin across the stage. We don't want you to do anything else because we know that you stutter over your words. You have a very hard time comprehending. And I could remember when it came to that most exciting part of the play, when all I had to do was roll Scrooge's coffin across the stage, I accidentally tripped over my brother's shoes that I was wearing, and at that time he wore size 10 and a half, and I tripped over in the coffin, and the coffin shot across the stage and fell off the stage. It became a hilarious moment. Nevertheless, when I got back to the classroom, the teacher and the students reminded me that I was a dumbbell. They reminded me that I could not do anything right. And that really, really traumatized me. Now, have you, in your experience, have you encountered patients or that have had similar stories or various types of trauma? And how did you actually coach them through that?
Well, I don't have any patients that had a story similar to that one. That's a very unique situation. But within your story, I heard a lot of things that really are indicative of kids who grow up in, in challenging situations or at high risk situations. The fact that you were wearing your brother's shoes that didn't fit your feet right and you were going to school, was a sign of neglect. And neglect is just one of the kind of adverse childhood experiences that a lot of kids experience at a young age that goes undetected by schools. And kids get labeled things like difficult in class, or they may be a label with learning disabilities, or they could be considered having ADHD, either being restless or inattentive in class, and become stigmatized and mistreated because of it. And so, and no one was actually asking deeper questions about why you were coming to school wearing clothes that weren't fitting you correctly, why you weren't able to pay attention in school, why were you so anxious that you were stuttering? Because in fact, you don't stutter now as an adult. And I'm sure, that might have taken some work, but a lot of kids get labeled incorrectly because no one asks deeper questions about what's going on at home.
Okay, wonderful. What are some of the challenges kids from high school or high risk families face in the school today?
Well, I think exactly that is that they often present as problem children. They're coming to school, they're not paying attention, or they're being disruptive. They may come into class angry, they may be picking on other kids, or they may be withdrawn and not paying attention at all in school. And teachers are sort of made responsible to try to get them to perform, both to do their schoolwork and to get good grades, when in fact they're coming out of situations that don't even prepare them to be ready to function well in the classroom. So if you're coming to school and you're hungry, or you just got yelled at by a parent, or you just saw one of your parents assaulted the night before by a boyfriend or their husband, or something going on, or they haven't had enough to eat, you can't come to school ready to do schoolwork under those conditions. It's very challenging for them to get their head in the game and focus and get good grades on your quiz,
Dawn, what is a common misconception about kids who come from high risk youth?
From high risk situations?
Yes.
Well, I think what some of the misconceptions are exactly what happened to you, is where people assume that they're not bright, or that they don't care, or that they have bad attitudes, and they're unteachable, or they don't want to learn. When in fact, those kids don't have the luxury of coming to school prepared to learn. And if someone would slow down and attend to their needs, we can try to help them get in a better state to learn. So in my early years as a therapist, one of the jobs that I did was I was working with kids who were in the foster care system. And some of those I'd have to go into the schools and do an assessment of what was happening, so that we could try to at least have them be successful, at least in one place. Some of them were disrupting their foster placements because they had so much trauma that they were terrified every time they got into a new placement. And when they got to school, they were disruptive. So we had to kind of analyze what was happening with them. And we could see that these kids were just so dysregulated, emotionally dysregulated, that anything could set them off. So sort of teaching them coping skills so that when they get to school, they could sit quietly, they could focus on their schoolwork, so they could be successful at least in one area of their life. And I know part of your story is really focused on that. That once people identified what was going on with you, they started giving you a little extra attention, making sure you had food to eat so that you could actually focus and learn in school.
Okay. What is the most important lesson you've learned about working with high-risk youth over your career?
One of the most important lessons that I learned is that kids are kids, and they want to be seen as smart, as funny, as valuable, as having something to say about things that are important to them. And these kids have hearts. And one of the skills that I used with kids was to treat kids, no matter what their situation was, like kids. I would read stories to them. I'd bring them milk and cookies, and I would sort of create a relaxing environment for them so they could feel comfortable opening up and talking about what was going on at home and how they could position themselves to be more successful both at home and at school. So treating kids like kids as whole people who need to be attended to, and as whole people was something that I learned.
Okay, wonderful.
Dawn, I got a question.
Yes.
So, a lot of times now, well, nowadays at least, you hear the word trauma a lot. Back then, you didn't.
Right.
It was just kind of like a normal thing. When do you think that shift happened to where people were more aware that trauma was actually happening?
Well, I think, clearly people always knew that kids were coming from dysfunctional families. We've been using that language, but we didn't really appreciate what the impact of all that dysfunction was having on the children. It wasn't until later on when a lot more research was coming out, and I know like in the early 2000s, the language of trauma started being more prevalent. And the language, as we were diagnosing all these kids with ADHD, and medicating all of the kids, you got to think it's kind of suspicious that why did we have kids who were going to school for a century with no meds, and then all of a sudden we have this outbreak that all the kids need medication. It's just like, it seems strange. But when people started examining what was happening and doing a lot of research on what works in school, there was a direct correlation between what was happening at home and what was happening at school. So once people recognized that adverse childhood experiences were actually where we're impacting kids' ability to function, then they started attending to those needs. There started being schools like school breakfast and lunch programs. People started recognizing that you need to feed these kids because we don't know when they're going to have their next meal, and that's traumatizing. They can't focus, So there was an ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that came out that showed the negative impact of adverse childhood experiences on children while they were children, and then the impact that it could have on adults as they grew up. And in the study showed that children who grow up with multiple adverse childhood experiences, such as even things like divorce or domestic violence, being neglected, being themselves abused, physically or sexually abused, having a parent go to jail, moving around too much, so housing insecurity or food insecurity, could cause effects of trauma and toxic stress. And they found out that toxic stress can cause everything from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, ADHD, but also long-term physical impacts. So people growing up with a lot of adverse childhood experiences have more hypertension, diabetes, all of the illnesses that you can think of. They have more stress-related things, more digestive-related things, obesity, and they have shorter lifespans. So this language of toxic stress is just not like, people use that language and throw it around. It's a real thing. That the stress is literally killing people. So preventing adverse childhood experiences really some of the things that the industry, the counseling industry, education industries are looking at, trying to identify who are the kids who are the most high risk for these adverse childhood experiences, and how can we intervene earlier so that they don't have these outcomes.
Wow.
Yeah, that's deep. In your opinion, what is the most important personality trait, strength, someone would need to work with high-risk youth?
I think compassion and kindness. Genuinely caring about a person for who they are. I think, again, when I said, unfortunately for teachers in schools, they're under so much pressure to extract performance out of kids that sometimes it's hard for them to be compassionate. But if they can sort of keep that at the forefront, kids will respond to that. Kids under the most difficult situations, Lonnie, that I spent maybe the first 6 years of my career in residential treatment
Yes.
facilities with some of the most high-risk kids who literally had been exposed to what I call rape, mayhem, and murder, literally, and many of them were extremely violent.
Can you explain what that building or that behavior center is?
Pardon me, say that again?
Can you explain what that behavioral center is?
Yeah, I worked in several in Kentucky before we moved to Florida. So I worked in several residential treatment facilities for kids who were considered having high risk behaviors themselves and had been exposed to a lot of traumatic things, and then were having a lot of big behaviors. So I worked with kids who were extremely violent themselves, and some of them were actually sexual offenders. I actually have a certification in juvenile sexual offenders. But most of those kids, when you dig beneath the surface, were themselves victims of sexual abuse. So they had been perpetrated on and then became perpetrators. This might be too much information.
No, that's perfect. That's what we need to hear, right, Phil?
That's exactly what we need to hear.
That's what we need to hear.
I've seen more than most. Let's say that.
Yeah, people may not know this information. The reason why I asked, because I don't know if Lonnie had told you about my son. Yeah, he's special needs, but he's violent, very violent.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were talks about putting him in one of those facilities, and I'm like, no, I don't think he can do that because I just didn't really know what it was. So that's why I was like, what is this place?
Is he autism spectrum disorder?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. Yeah.
Yep, he's nonverbal too, so I don't even think that'll even work.
And you guys have worked with an ABA therapist?
Oh yeah, we're in all of that. But I do have a question about trauma though, and kids. Kids may be seeing that they're oblivious to a lot of things, right? So what age do you think they actually realize that they have either A, been abused, or B, have gone through trauma? And that's not just
kids
normal.
Kids are so smart. And that is part of what really upsets adults. Because kids aren't stupid. They know something's wrong. And they know something's wrong. And that's part of why they act out. So particularly the ones, and I'm not talking about those who have who have severe persistent learning disabilities or necessarily autism spectrum, but kids with who have at least average intelligence, and even many who are borderline intellectual, they know when adults lie, they know when adults cheat, and they will call them out. And often the reason why they end up in these places is because they're being scapegoated, right? So if mom has a drinking or drug problem, or mom's boyfriend has one, or dad's very violent, kids will act out to draw attention to the problem. And Lonnie, you have some stories about that. How, one kid will be the scapegoat and they'll say they're the problem child. But usually what they're doing is they're acting out literally as a cry for help, and nobody's listening. They get labeled as the one who's the problem, but these are learned behaviors often. Sometimes they have parents who they themselves have PTSD and have really bad emotional regulation skills. So they may have borderline personality disorder. They may have bipolar disorder, and the kids are repeating the exact behaviors they're seeing their parents do. But it shows up at school. And of course it's not acceptable behavior at school. So they know really young, and I mean 3 and 4 years old, So when therapists go in to work with these families, although the parents will call them in to work with the kids, we really try to get the parents involved and analyze their parenting skills and try to teach them more effective ways of parenting their kids, because any kid will respond to consistency. So being firm and consistent. But if you're a distracted parent who unfortunately has other more important things on their mind, and sometimes it really is they're distracted by needing to work, or they're working more than one job. Some of them are distracted by relationship partners, drugs and alcohol. Some of them are distracted by their own trauma, and they're not focusing on parenting their children. Then the kids are just sort of making it up. They're just making it up as they go, and then they get, blamed for the problem. So teaching parents more hands-on and consistent parenting skills is what we will really try to focus on, because if you can get the parents to be consistent, the kids will be will be more consistent.
That's got to be harder though.
Yeah,
To
it is
get the
100%.
parents on board, right?
It's much easier to lock the kids up, you know. Well, you know what I mean. Particularly when there's bigger problems like again, like drugs and alcohol, or if there's some sort of domestic violence situation that the parent is caught up in. It's really hard for them to see, you know, that they need to be consistent. And unfortunately, you know, when you're dealing with parents and they have multiple children they're trying to raise, that's a lot. And trying to keep a roof over your head, that's a lot. And often they're trying to still have a relationship because most of these parents are pretty young, you know, and they want to have a relationship, but that can be distracting if their partner also is, you know, bringing more, you know.
Dawn, what do you think about the support systems? Are there any support programs for families to help children overcome the obstacles that they're being faced with in their environment?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, the schools and churches have historically, at least in, let's say, Black communities, have historically been places, and then things like Boys and Girls Club and things like that have been sort of like some of the historic places where kids have gotten external support sort of in an organic way. Those are the sort of the first line defenses for kids where they interact with adults who are supposed to be helping them. But the main thing was they have to have their antennas up and really be paying attention to what's going on with the kids and not just be so focused on who's following or breaking the rules. And I know that in schools nowadays, the focus on like zero tolerance, that kind of language with kids becomes more punitive, and they're being, you know, a lot of kids are getting in, if they get in a fight or just hit somebody once. And I'm not saying what the rules should be, but what I'm saying is the focus on rules and not really effective interventions has sort of, I think, made it harder for some of these first line defenses that we would have been in place before to be helpful, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. I also wanted to ask, this problem, is it just only in a certain income bracket?
Not at all. Of course, we know that people who are struggling are more stressed than financially, are more stressed than people who aren't struggling financially. And so financial distress and people who historically have been disadvantaged socially, politically, economically, have more social stressors, which means it creates more instability for families, which can then fuel some of these things that I'm talking about. But this can show up in any socioeconomic bracket. So I didn't mean to imply that if I did in some way, but we do know that, of course, social, economic, those kind of factors put such a great pressure on families that, you know, that destabilizes the foundation of families. And you know this, like any time we have a family where, that's why divorce is one of the adverse childhood experiences that's on the list that we screen for, because for women, divorce can be, historically has been more devastating for women than men. That is shifting just recently in the last few years, where women are now earning higher incomes across the board. But for many women, if you have 1, 2, or 3 children that you're responsible for, and you end up not being able to rely on the income of their father, it's puts a lot more pressure on you to be less focused on parenting and more focused on just keeping a roof over your head. And we know economically in Florida that is a huge problem. Like the threat of homelessness or housing instability in Florida for young families is just it's an epidemic problem here.
Do you see a solution?
I don't see a solution, and I wouldn't even pretend to. I mean, they did need more affordable housing, and Florida is not necessarily as responsive to people of lower income, because you know it's a playground for the rich and famous from literally all over the world. This state has some of the widest economic disparities than any other state in the country. It has, when you can go to Miami and South Florida and see boats as big as hotels, you know, you got some major economic disparities. The day Honey came home from the hospital, it is challenging because when kids attempt suicide, that clearly they're feeling that they can't think of a better way to deal with the problems that they have. So, it is sort of a wake up call for everyone who's in this child's life to pay more attention, to become more involved, and to model better coping skills and to teach better coping skills for kids. So again, we know unfortunately that kids who are exposed to trauma or who know someone who committed suicide are more likely to attempt it. And so that whole idea that, and again, if you see adults around you who can't seem to handle life on life's terms, then things seem hopeless. So teaching kids coping skills and modeling good coping skills. And in all of my stories, it's actually somehow these stories are all linked through one family, believe it or not. And the cousin, in the first story, the day my cousin Dante died, the girl who later attempted suicide was one of his cousins. And she was so upset by his death that she didn't know how to deal with it. And the family, they were having trouble grieving, and then they realized they needed to pay closer attention to all the other kids in the family too. So,
well, it's very interesting because all of this ties into the family, the environment, and what have you. So, do you have any last moment words for our audience? A word of encouragement?
I can't think of any. No. What was the other question I gave you? Asked me one of them.
You answered all of them.
All of them? I did 7.
Yes.
You sure?
You did 8.
Did it?
8 questions. Let me double check.
Give you some. You sure?
You did 8 questions. You did everything. So it's been a great honor and a blessing to have you with our first podcast, one of our first podcasts. So thank you so much. No final words for us. What is that one special word?
My final word is, I appreciate you doing the podcast. I understand what you're trying to do is sort of get the word out to encourage people that no matter what they've been through, if they persevere, if they focus on accomplishing their goals, that they can turn their lives around. And I think having a message of hope like that is really important for people. So I'm really proud of you, and I'm really, I'm hoping that other people will see this and can see, what faith can do, what hope can do, what love can do. And there's life after.
Yes.
When they hear more of your story through, what you share, they'll see there's hope out there.
Well, I thank you, Dawn, and I'm just so blessed because I would have never gotten to this point in my life, in my career, without your love and your support. And you have really, really helped me, especially getting through this doctoral program. I would have never got to this point. So I say thank you. I love you. The blessing of the Lord, it maketh rich. He addeth no sorrow with it. And I'm just blessed. And I thank you all for taking the moment to join us in this episode here. And we look forward to the next episode. Right now, I'm just praying for you, for your families. I'm praying for your children, your loved ones, that they can be all that God has called them to be. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you and seeing you in the next episode.